You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Anne Devereux-Mills.
At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. You're going to love this series. I love it so much. And Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it. And be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories, Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Do you have a favorite writer whose books are auto-buys for you? Wouldn't you love for readers to have you on their auto-buy list, then recommend your books to their friends and on social media? The good news is there are subtle things you can do, things that are nearly invisible to the reader, that will make your stories unputdownable. The Beyond 10 Days course from Victory Editing can help you get the most from your stories and help you build that relationship with readers through your writing. This course is full of awesome, and best of all, you don't have to fly across the country or put on pants. In this course, we'll focus on avoiding info dumps, dialogue mechanics, show versus tell in dialogue, carrying show versus tell forward to your narrative, deepening your point of view and strengthening your protagonist's voice, overwriting and how to avoid it. 10 hours of video content with text and audio downloads. Shine that diamond. Join me at the Beyond 10 Days course. Go to hankgarner.com and click the banner to sign up today. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have my new friend, Anne Devereux-Mills, on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book. It's called The Parlay Effect, How Female Connection Can Change the World. Welcome to the show, Anne.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you. The book is fantastic, and I can't wait to talk about it. But before we do, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I'm not sure if I wanted to be or if I just was one. I had a very creative imagination as a young child, and so if I wanted to do something like quit ice skating lessons, instead of saying at 5 years old, I want to quit ice skating lessons, I would make up very complex stories about how I needed to move to Chicago to take care of my ailing uncle. And I've always been highly creative with the imagination from as young as I can remember.
That is fantastic. How often did that get you in trouble?
A lot.
Oh, yeah. I was one of those kids, too, that I just created the world I wanted to live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have a daughter who, without my ever telling her any of these stories, came up with her imaginary friend, Fred, who constantly got her in trouble, covering her naked body head to toe with Vaseline. And I can't even tell you the number of times her imaginary friend got her in trouble. So I guess this is a genetic thing.
Oh, that is fantastic. That is fantastic. Anne, were you a bookish kid?
I was a kid who fell in love with the stories of other people, and I think that sort of became who I am now. So, whether it was fiction or whether it was, some sort of autobiography. I'll tell you another funny story from childhood. I got to, I don't know when you start learning to write cursive, first grade maybe, and my name was spelled ANN, and to me that seemed really boring, and I had wished I had a very glamorous name, which I didn't. And so I decided to start writing my name with an E, A-N-N-E, to make it look more flourishy and dramatic. And I have no recollection of anyone coming up with that idea other than me until a new TV series on Netflix just came out called Anne with an E. And it's the story of Anne of Green Gables.
Yes.
And I don't know whether I read it or I heard it, but somehow it made its way into my mind and, again, helped me make my life more elaborate than it was.
I love that. Well, at least you didn't want to call yourself Cordelia.
I probably would have.
Probably. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And as you grew up and, were finding your place in the world, what was it that you decided to pursue career-wise?
I'm not sure if I decided to pursue it or fell into it after a very unsuccessful career in the world of insurance, where I was just sort of bored to tears, wrong alignment for me and how my brain worked. I found myself in the world of advertising. And, this makes sense as a storyteller because so much of what advertising agencies do, even the big ones in New York, which is where I was understand the needs of our target audience and craft stories that made us relevant. And so, the fact that I've always been in this world of articulating ideas and understanding how they meet the way people live their lives, that was sort of where my passion and my prowess intersected. And it was just the right career for me for many, many years.
I've always been fascinated with people that work in advertising and the psychology behind advertising because
that's the best part.
Yeah, like you talked about, we're telling stories, and we're telling stories that will affect people on an emotional level and that will give them some connection to a product or a service or something sometimes something just intangible. But our desire is to make people feel something for this thing that we're trying to sell them.
Exactly. And a lot of times it's what we would call in the business a parody product. So how do you differentiate between things that are pretty much the same? Well, a lot of it comes down to the imagery and the storytelling that somehow says to the customer, I choose A over B for that, the reason that's related to the story, not the product that's just the same as the other product.
Right. I mean, even down to, just inane things like Coke versus Pepsi. If you go to a restaurant and you say, I would like a Diet Coke, and they say, oh, we have Pepsi products, and you can watch people's faces, around the table that, they have an emotional connection to this drink, and they may not have ever even tasted the opposite one, but they just know that this is something I have a deep connection with. It's very, very strange, but fascinating at the same time.
It is. It truly is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I worked for one of the agencies that worked on one of those brands, so I definitely saw some of the market research behind the scenes and understood that fierce brand loyalty.
When you're in the advertising industry, is that something that you talk about, the power of story and how you're connecting with people?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So before you even start to come up with the creative idea, you get very, very specific about who is the person you're trying to reach? Where do they live? What is their life like? What works really well for them and their other favorite things? What are the things that they would run screaming from? I mean, you really want to develop as clear a possible visual of who your target is, because that way when you develop the messaging and when you cast the talent and when you create the the scene, and when you choose the colors, and all of those things are determined by a very clear image of your lead character.
Wow. I just love the whole mindset of it. As storytellers, we can always learn from, people that tell stories in different formats and different, with different focus. I love digging into what connects with people on a deep level.
I do too. And I think that's probably what led me to write this book on a personal level, because so much of what the Parlay Effect is about is telling the tale of my personal story in the world of advertising, where a confluence of events where I had a recurrence of cancer that happened while I was running a company during the recession. My last child was about to leave home, and instead of giving me time to have my surgery, my boss decided to have someone else run the company. And I lost my job, my health, and my last kid at home all at once. And so my story was really when you can no longer describe yourself by what you do for a living, or whose mother you are, or whether you're at the gym at 5:30 in the morning with the other athletic kids. When you're none of those things, what are you? And so my story is about choosing and recrafting my next chapter in my personal story.
So let's back up just a little bit. You're working in advertising. You were working at the highest levels of the advertising industry, and you have to deal with this personal struggle. You found out that you had cancer?
Yep. I found out I had cancer before, but I found out that the cells had come back and were accelerating rapidly. And so that it didn't take over my body, I needed to have more of my body removed. And I was a single mom. I was commuting from New Jersey into New York at 4:45 in the morning and walking across Manhattan in my 4-inch heels and going to the gym and running the company and getting home to be a mom. And it was a very tough life. I'd shovel the driveway myself on the snowy days and fight the traffic as much as I had to every day. And it's very stressful. So do I think that living that crazy life of trying to be Wonder Woman caused my cancer to come back? No, but I definitely think that being in sort of this intense, competitive, exhausted state of trying to be everything for everybody, that's what happened.
Well, in reading your book, the thing that struck me is that this is a struggle that all of us wrestle with. Am I an author? Am I a podcaster? Am I a husband? Am I a father? I'm all of those things, but none of those things define me definitively. I'm all of those things plus more. And this really made me stop and think about the things that we put value on, and some of those things are very noble and we should put value on. But there's a balance between valuing those things and deriving all of your identity from it. Where were you in this process when you start wrestling with those questions?
Because my oldest daughter was already away at college and my youngest was getting ready to go, I had started to add things that were meaningful to my life, like helping start a school in Uganda for kids who didn't have access to education, nutrition, healthcare. And so I had spent a couple of years sort of shifting towards a focus on community in one aspect of my life. But it was sort of supplementary to the core things that defined me, which were work and motherhood. But luckily I had already started to get a taste of how good it feels to be doing things that are not about personal success, that are really lifting other people up. And I think that was definitely taken into consideration when I had to decide, okay, what's this next chapter going to be about? Because all the things that it was about are gone. And I spent a lot of time in what I call the space in between, which means after everything you understood yourself to be and understood what to do, and before you've figured out what's next. And that's a scary place. I mean, for me, it was a place of lots of deep emotion and sadness and self-doubt and failure because I had been running so hard, I didn't have to feel. I was just doing. And so when I stopped doing and I started feeling, it was terrifying.
Well, in my notes,
to go through that.
Right. In my notes, when I was preparing to talk to you, I wrote that down. After what was and before what could be. That just jumped off the page at me. And it's really bizarre to say out loud, but sometimes when we go through these big upheavals in life, like a cancer, or maybe one of our children gets sick, or unemployment. There's these things, and when you're in the midst of those, you can't see anything good in it. But on the other side of it, perspective is a powerful thing, and getting to wrestle with that question of after what was and before what could be. That's actually a great place to be. That very few of us get the gift of very often, because we're so busy.
It didn't feel like a very nice
but it doesn't
gift
feel right. But it doesn't feel like a gift at the time. It doesn't feel empowering. But the ability to get to wrestle with that is something that a lot of people don't get. And it feels like darkness at the time, but as you're kind of wrestling with that idea of being in the middle, in that kind of unclaimed space, what did you begin to do to find your path?
Yeah, so, it was a lot of sort of retrospective thinking and a lot of looking around. So the retrospective thinking was, what are the times in my life where I felt really good? And when I got sick and lost my job, I had this very negative awakening that while I'd worked with thousands of people in the industry and over my career, I was a multiple time CEO and, had worked my way up in the business. I really had worked with thousands of people. When I got sick and lost power, almost none of those people were there for me. And it's because I didn't have anything to offer. I had no job. I had no influence. And I realized that one thing I didn't want to jump back into were a whole series of transactional relationships that are about extracting from each other and superficial networking and who do you know and what can you do for me and what can I do for you. I wanted some of the intimacy that I'd had in childhood with my sisters, or at Wellesley College, which is an all-women's college where I went to school. There was 2,000 amazing women who I could really talk more openly with and be myself. And I started looking at places where I'd really been able to be vulnerable and be open about not only feeling great, but feeling terrible, and helping other people who, if I hadn't stepped forward and said, wow, that really made me feel X, and they could say, oh my gosh, I felt the same way. Having those moments of me too, where me too doesn't mean, what it means now from a sexual harassment standpoint, but it means, yes, I had that life experience myself, and the things that you're saying you want and, are optimistic about and live for and are fearful of and want to get behind you, I'm in that situation. And so I really look to create spaces to have those shared experiences and shared truths with people who are not just like me. I was pretty tired of being in a world where everybody who was in that world achieved the level of success, sort of had white skin, was, reasonably successful, was probably in the same life stage. Because the times when I'd really grown most and had most engagement were when I was dealing with my daughter's friends or my mother and her, contemporaries, or people who came from different backgrounds. And, I just found I was missing diversity and richness in conversation and experience in my life. So I really set out to find that.
You talk about relationships that are transactional in nature, and sadly, when we start examining our own lives and relationships, a lot of those are like that. We're bonded by who our kids have play dates with, or people that we work with, and we depend on them for one thing or another. And it's there are very few unconditional relationships in our lives. You set out to make these spaces where that could happen intentionally, on purpose. What was the genesis of Parlay House?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did when leaving what was to take a look at a personal relationship I had. I had been single for a while, but I'd been dating an amazing guy who lived in San Francisco. Actually, he lived in Santa Cruz, California. And I was in New York, and, he was with me for the surgery and sort of said, honey, getting up, going out, getting another job in New York, running another agency, it kind of seems to be killing you, and maybe you should start again. And why don't you consider moving out to California with me? And my first reaction was, I'm a city girl. There's no way I can live in Santa Cruz. But the second reaction was, I grew up in Seattle, and I love the West Coast. And I would love to try something new. It was sort of an appropriate time to start again because so many of the things that were keeping me in New York were gone. And so I just took a flying leap, jumped on a plane, moved out to San Francisco. We bought a house together. And before I knew it, there I was. I was standing on the roof of my house looking out over the bay and thinking, oh, this is amazing. I'm going to call a girlfriend and have her over for a glass of wine. And then I realized, I didn't have a girlfriend. I actually moved to a city where I didn't know anybody. And so I obviously wanted, I call it 4 quarters instead of 100 pennies. I didn't want the transactional relationships of people who were not going to be there for me. I wanted a few close, intimate friends with whom I really could share my life. But I didn't know how to start. And so I pulled from an experience I had when I was in my career, sort of big time, which was being a fellow of the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute is kind of this values-based learning organization that takes a lot of leaders and helps them be leaders who are going to do good for the world as well as for themselves. And one of the things that I did over this 2-year period of being a fellow was met on an ongoing basis with 20 people who were not like me. So public sector, private sector, Republican, Democrat, male, female, American, non-American, gay, straight, etc. And despite all of those differences in how we lived our lives and how we saw the world, by sharing experiences together, it might have been listening to a piece of music, reading a piece of poetry, reading a book, whatever it was, it allowed us to find common ground where then we could dig deeper into our real truths and the things that really mattered. And I thought, can I use that model somehow to start to create my intimate circle? So I called on friends of friends and said, look, I'm in San Francisco. Who do you know? Do you know anybody who might want to do this experiment and get together and come over to my house? And I know there's strangers coming over to my house, but, how do I get started? And I ended up with a living room filled with about 12 people. And they were young and old and, career-oriented and stay-at-home moms and, diverse in race and sexual orientation. And we just started talking. And all of a sudden, sharing some content. One of my friends is a poet, and she wasn't really talking about how to make poetry accessible, although that was, sort of what we said it was about. But really, it was just about establishing some common dialogue so that then we could dig deeper on our personal stories. And it was fabulous. Everyone at the end said, this was great. I have another friend I'd like to bring. Let's do this next month. And 12 turned into 40, turned into 80. Then it grew to New York and to Oakland, and we're about to open in Atlanta, and we're in Paris and London, and now we have 5,000 women in 9 cities around the world who get together on a recurring basis with people who are not just like them and talk about things that really matter. And so what I was doing, which is just like back to the beginning of this conversation when we talked about the world of advertising, I was getting at where I was in my life and what were my truths, true experiences, true aspirations, behaviors, etc., and finding ways to extend that and open that up for other people to have those same conversations. So one of the most interesting things we found was many of us who were willing to participate with strangers in strange homes, whether it's hosting or attending or putting yourself out there without knowing anybody, were in some sort of transition. And David Brooks, the New York columnist, gave a talk that I heard recently where his research noted that 50% of us at any given time are in some sort of transition. It might be a career transition, it might be a relationship, it might be a job stage, it might be a home, it might be, something related to your kids. But when you're not just doing, when something is changing enough that you have to lift your head up out of your phone, out of your computer, out of your office and sort of look around, it's a much better time for engaging with other people. So this organization called Parlay House is now sort of exploding because my need to get outside of my bubble and get outside of my own head and find ways to connect with other people and redefine communities in a supportive and inclusive sort of way seems to be the same thing for many other people around the world.
And even though Parlay House is exploding and reaching more and more people in cities all over, you can't reach every single person that way. We're just too scattered. But that's where the book comes in, the Parlay Effect.
Exactly.
How did the idea for go from this thing that you'd created and this honest connection that you had fostered to let me create something that we can get out wider than this and maybe foster people to do their own connective work.
Exactly. So what happened was I started hearing stories of a cascade of events that would happen after a Parlay House event. And I would observe it, both directly and indirectly as an extension of Parlay House. So one gathering, we had a panel of 4 women who had followed their husbands to Singapore. Their husbands were transferred there and they were expat wives. And they were sort of chatting one day and each of them acknowledged that she had gotten off of her own path, whether she wanted to write a book or she wanted to start a consulting business or she wanted to learn a new craft. And these women said, why don't we call it regroup and just support each other and hold each other accountable for doing whatever, without judgment, whatever the thing is that each of us has been wanting to accomplish that we can't seem to get started doing. So they were a panel talking to my group in San Francisco about that. One of the women in the audience was a doctor who had had a very successful career but was feeling sort of unfulfilled. And she thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I need. And she formed another similar organization, pulling in more women from San Francisco. And as they held each other accountable, other women started hearing about this and more groups formed. So I started seeing this cascade of people witnessing and hearing these stories and then actions happening that were more and more inclusive. And I thought, wow, we really are affecting more people than just those who show up at my house. How do we track that? How do I know what this is? I called it the Parlay Effect, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So I reached out to a social scientist at University of California, Berkeley, an amazing woman named Serena Chen. We had a lot of ways we identified with each other through shared experiences. She too was a single mom, raising a daughter, an activist in sort of women's support and issues. And so we said, can we do a quantitative research study? I feel like what I'm seeing is qualitative and maybe it's just pay it forward. And I'm kind of seeing people living a life about paying it forward. What is this and how do we figure it out? So we did an online research study with about 350 people, ages 18 to 44 years old. And we grouped them into one of 3 buckets. The first bucket we called the givers. And we said to them, can you tell us a time where you did something for someone else, something thoughtful, kind, inclusive, generous, mentoring, coaching, that somehow made a difference in their lives? Tell us that story. And the second bucket of people, we said, you're the recipient or the receiver. Can you tell us a story of some time when somebody did something for you that changed how you behaved, how you saw the world, how you interacted with other people. Tell us what being the recipient of something unexpectedly good did for you. And then we thought, we don't want this research to fail. What if nobody can think of any story where they did anything that had an effect or anybody did anything for them? So we created this third bucket, which we called the witnesses. You didn't do anything nice. No one did anything nice for you, but you know of something, you saw something, you witnessed something. Well, you might imagine that the givers came back, and they're those people you sort of know that already are looking around them and thinking about thoughtful ways to help other people in some way. And that was, heartwarming to see. And, in a time where our society is so divided, it was great seeing the number of people who had really terrific stories of how through actions that weren't related to money or power, but were related to interacting with other people, they were able to lift up someone else. And when we heard from that someone else who received something, the amazing thing was not just that they remembered receiving it, but they were inherently changed as being a receiver. So they would understand the power of helping someone do something that came easy to them, whether it was in a work situation, coaching someone, whether it was passing on something that they didn't need to someone who they could see really needed it. They felt dramatically more empowered and positive by replicating the acts of kindness that came to them. The most interesting bucket, though, because that still feels like pay it forward. You've got a giver to a receiver who becomes a giver to a receiver. The witnesses who were not part of the chain that they told us about were super interesting, because they would tell a story of seeing someone come out of a 7-Eleven with an extra sandwich for the homeless guy, and how that homeless guy walked across the street and shared the sandwich with one or two other people, so that you could sort of see this multiplier of one nice thing, help fill the stomachs of three people who needed it. But that person who watched that would then, a couple questions in our survey later, talk to us about how they replicated in some way that action. And so we're not only seeing this linear one-to-one-to-one. What we're seeing is when you're sort of overt, not braggy, but just doing something that other people can see happening, extending something to a stranger in some way, all of a sudden other people start getting that they can do that too. And so it became a cascade rather than just a linear chain, and that's what we call the parlay effect.
And so in this book, you've taken your story and stories of people that you've met and shared these principles, but also told people's stories along with it, which we know is what really connects with people, when we can put a face and a voice to these things. I know that the subtitle of the book is How Female Connection Can Change the World, but this book really challenged me to take a look at the relationships I have, and we all need connection with other people, honest connection, and I think this book can, will reach a wider audience, because as men we need these connections as well.
I agree. It's funny. I am often a guest speaker at business schools and whatever, and I've done one class a few years in a row about gender and the role of gender in business. And 3 years ago, the class was all women, and 2 years ago, there were a couple of gay men in the class. And last year, and this is international business school students, the class was about 50-50 male-female. And the first question that was asked to me during the question and answer period was from a man who came from rural India, from a very small town with traditional values, and he said, I want to live a life that's connected with broad ranges of people, and where I can be vulnerable and get support, and when I can help other people. Where is the Parlay House for me, and how can I start that? And I thought, you're absolutely right. There's so many places in society where, even though men have benefits on certain levels, they actually are not included in the conversations that are so needed, related to relationships and vulnerability and authenticity and trust. And we need to do that.
Encouraging everyone to have honest relationships where we're accountable to one another, and where we're sharing our struggles. That just makes better people. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I love what you're doing, and I love the new book. We're going to put links to it in the show notes of this episode. It's available in paperback and Kindle edition everywhere. Now, if people are interested in what you're doing and intrigued by the story, where can they connect with you online to dig into more about the Parlay House and all of the work that you do?
Yeah, fantastic. I would love that. So there's a website, parlayhouse.com, Parlay, house.com, or my personal site, Anne Devereux-Mills.com. And you can find out, there's also the parlayeffect.com. So you can really find a million ways to get in touch with us. And, there's so many extensions of things that we can do to help lift each other that, the more we're connected, the stronger we are as individuals and as communities. So please do reach out, because I'm capturing these conversations and spreading them to the world and encouraging people for their own inclusive communities, and just so happy to be part of this process.
The book, The Parlay Effect, How Female Connection Can Change the World, available everywhere now. Check the show notes for a link. Go pick up your copy and connect with Anne. Anne, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I loved it.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, Or maybe Jessica, in his applied robotics course, wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right. Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.